Russia is still making billions of dollars per year from its gas. That shouldn't be happening. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the West collectively implemented sanctions that were supposed to strike at the heart of the country's fossil fuel sector. Those sanctions have done some damage, but it's nowhere near enough. Enter Ukraine. While the West talks, Ukraine acted. It just did in hours what took Western sanctions years to achieve, with a devastating strike against Russia's gas pipelines that has cut off one of Vladimir Putin's most vital war lifelines. On August 4, Defense Mirror reported on a series of explosions that completely halted the flow of gas through the Central Asia Center pipeline. That pipeline, which stretches through Russia into many of its Central Asian territories and carries Turkmen gas northward into Russia rather than directly into China, was hit in the Volgograd region of Russia. The actual blast had occurred 2 days before its report, Defense Mirror says, and they were powerful enough to completely destroy a section of the vital pipeline. Emergency services and police were deployed, but there was nothing they could do. According to Defense Mirror, the pipeline was forced to shut down indefinitely. Ukraine had struck again. The Kyiv Post also reported on the strike, noting that it took place near the village of Demikhovsky, which is in the Nikolaevsky district of Volgograd. The attack was a culmination of Ukrainian strikes that had taken place over the prior weekend, all of which targeted Russia's oil and defense infrastructure. All were carried out by Ukraine's SBU, HUR, and its unmanned systems forces, the outlet reports. The attack on the Central Asia Center pipeline was the crescendo, the glorious conclusion to a weekend of strikes that battered Russia's energy sector. And boy, did it ever have an impact. In its report on Ukraine's pipeline strike, Euromaidan Press repeated the claim that the entire pipeline had to be shut down. No more gas flowing created major problems inside Russia, as it explained. This strategic attack, confirmed by Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, not only disrupted the gas transit, but also directly affected energy supplies to multiple key military-industrial facilities across Russia, dependent on energy plants that fully receive their gas from this pipeline. The point of Ukraine's strike becomes even clearer. On the surface, hitting such a massive pipeline means that Ukraine gets to prevent Russia from selling its gas to customers throughout Central Asia, with some of that gas later making its way to China through other pipelines. That's massive in its own right, and it's a point that will be dug deeper into later in the video. However, the underappreciated fact is that Ukraine struck multiple blows against Russia on August 2nd. A pipeline went down, but so did many of Russia's military production facilities, many of which depend on a consistent flow of gas to operate. No gas means no more Russian military equipment being built by those factories. And it's still unknown when Russia will be able to get its pipeline back online. Euromaidan Press says that among the affected facilities was the Demikhovsky machine building plant. That plant is one of Russia's largest manufacturers of rail vehicles, and it's been running since May 1935. Rail is key to Russia's war effort. Most of the country's equipment is transported via the 75,800 miles of rail arteries that stretch across the nation and into Ukraine. Russia's reliance on rail is so pronounced that Ukraine has even started targeting the armoured railway carriages Putin is using to keep his troops supplied on the front lines. Learn more about those strikes in our recent video. But by taking out the Central Asia Center pipeline, Ukraine has just struck a massive blow that's going to prevent Russia from building more rail vehicles to replace those it's losing to Ukrainian strikes. Beyond that facility, Ukraine's pipeline strike has also impacted Russia's MiG Aircraft Corporation. That company needs no introduction. It's behind the creation of the MiG fighter jets that Russia is using to launch missiles and glide bombs into Ukraine. The Magnum-K ammunition factory has also been cut off from its vital gas supplies, meaning Ukraine has just scored a quadruple whammy. Russian gas is shut down. Russians' rail vehicles aren't being built. The MiG Aircraft Corporation can't build or restore aircraft, and ammunition that was being produced inside Russia for its soldiers to use on the front lines is no longer being made. All of this showcases why the Central Asia Center pipeline is so important to Russia's war effort. But it goes much deeper than that. China's already been mentioned several times already during this video. Technically, the Central Asia Center pipeline doesn't run into China. As the name implies, it connects Russia to several Central Asian countries with which it shares a gas trading relationship. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan are among those countries, and all three rely on the pipeline Ukraine just shut down to shuttle gas northward into Russia. While the Central Asia Center pipeline doesn't connect directly to China, the Central Asia-China pipeline does. That 1,139-mile pipeline runs from Turkmenistan into Xinjiang, with a few offshoots that go into Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Those pipelines are supplying China with a constant supply of gas from Russia and the Central Asian states that fall under its sway. It's easy to see where this is going. China may not be getting gas directly from the pipeline that Ukraine shut down on August 2nd. However, much of the gas that flows through that pipeline ends up in the Central Asian countries. It's not much of a leap to assume that a lot of that gas then gets transferred to the Central Asia Center pipeline, allowing Russia and the Central Asian states with which it works to supply China. It's all one massive network. Now, a deeper look into the politics surrounding that network will follow soon, and it's one that Russia has been using to great effect to increase its geopolitical influence over all of Asia. When it comes to Central Asia, the Central Asia Center pipeline serves as a dual purpose. It allows Russia to exert some level of influence over the three other countries connected to that pipeline. All three rely, at least to some extent, on the income they make from Russian purchases of their gas. Russia knows this, and it knows that it could take all of that money away if it needs to get any of those three countries back in line. Not that it's likely to do so. As Euromaidan Press points out, the Central Asia Center pipeline also channels gas into Russia as it needs it, allowing it to fuel the industrial sector that Ukraine has just closed down. OSW's Center for Eastern Studies looked at this attempt by Russia to deepen the dependence of the Central Asian states on Russian gas back in October 2023. It says that several of the countries connected to the Central Asia Center pipeline want to get their hands on as much Russian gas as they can so they can develop their own gas fields. Again, that's great for Russia. It means that Russia can influence the development of gas fields in countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Without Russia, those countries can't reach their full potential. With Russia, they can enrich themselves. Granted, the dependence that Russia has managed to foster among these nations thus far is limited, OSW points out, but it's a potential stepping stone toward the creation of what the outlet dubs a gas union that will expand Russia's already considerable influence within the Central Asian territories. So, back to the previously mentioned connection to China and Russia's attempts to gain influence through gas in Beijing. According to the South China Morning Post, the Central Asia-China gas pipeline is a $7.3 billion pipeline that currently sees China import 55 billion cubic meters of gas per year from Turkmenistan. Another line connecting this main gas artery is currently under construction, through which China will be able to buy another 15 billion cubic meters of gas annually. Much of that gas comes from Turkmenistan's own supplies. Experts estimate the country has gas reserves of anywhere between 50 to 400 trillion cubic feet. China is Turkmenistan's only major customer for its gas. So, what does any of that have to do with Russia? IntelliNews explained in a May 2024 article. It notes that Turkmenistan has only recently started taking advantage of its vast gas reserves, and it's only able to do that when a country invests heavily in building a pipeline that links it to Turkmenistan. China did that, and Russia wasn't happy. Pricing disputes between Russia and Turkmenistan have led to Russia cutting off its exports and imports at various points over the last couple of decades. As of 2024, Russia has been trying to squeeze Turkmenistan out of the gas game, using Kazakhstan as a conduit for the gas it sends to Uzbekistan, rather than for direct delivery to China. Doran Abayev, who was Kazakhstan's ambassador to Russia at the time of IntelliNews' article, highlighted that the plan was already in place. "We're talking about 35 billion cubic meters of gas that will be supplied to China," he said. And much of that gas isn't being produced by Uzbekistan. It's coming from Russia, arriving in Uzbekistan via the Central Asia Center pipeline before being sold on via the Central Asia-China line. What's happening with the Central Asia-China pipeline is a convoluted mess of internal politics and Russian power plays. But it ultimately all comes back down to the pipeline that Ukraine took out on August 2nd. With that pipeline down, Russia can't send gas to Uzbekistan. Without that gas, Russia and Uzbekistan can't continue their joint campaign to try and push Turkmenistan from its dominant position with the Central Asia-China pipeline. No campaign means no pressure, and no pressure means China will continue buying from Turkmenistan instead of a Russian proxy. Thus, Russia's influence over China weakens. The Central Asia Center pipeline is key to it all. It's an important tool to keep the energy networks of Russia and the Central Asian countries interlinked and interdependent, Euromaidan Press points out. It's all about leverage, and Russia just lost a ton of it thanks to its main gas pipeline serving Central Asia being taken out. Ukraine sent a message with its August 2nd attack. It showed Putin that it's not just oil refineries and dedicated military facilities that are on its radar. Gas pipelines are now on the agenda. And the terrifying thing for Russia is that these pipelines represent far easier targets than what Ukraine has already proven it can hit with its deep strikes over the past couple of years. Gas pipelines are vast targets. They have to be by their very nature. Spanning hundreds, if not thousands of miles, these pipelines are incredibly difficult to defend because they often stretch over remote terrain that leaves them exposed. Some air defenses may be placed at critical points in the pipelines, but no country has enough to protect every single mile. That's especially the case for Russia, which has already lost 1,205 anti-aircraft warfare units in the Ukraine war and has grown so desperate that it's pulling S-300 and S-400 units from Asia, replacing them with decoys that can't do anything, according to United 24 media. This isn't some sort of massive revelation. The vulnerability of gas pipelines has been known for decades. Way back in 2003, the then Energy Program Director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Robert Ebel, highlighted the problem to the LA Times. "Pipelines are very soft targets," Ebel said. "They're easy to go after. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where you can do the most damage, both physical and psychological, with the minimum amount of effort and the minimum chance of being caught." He was talking about the situation in the Middle East at the time. Not a lot has changed in the 22 years since, and Ukraine has just realized it. The Central Asia Center is the very definition of a soft target given Russia's air defense challenges. Now that Ukraine has proven that it can hit the pipeline, the odds are high that far more attacks are bound to occur in the coming months, all designed to take out Russian gas. Now, all of this is happening as Russia is desperately trying to pivot away from Europe and toward Asia to find gas customers. The Warwick Business School in the UK says that December 31st, 2024 saw Russia's contract for transiting its gas through Ukraine expire, with Ukraine not even considering a renewal. That expiration came a couple of months before the European Union or EU ban on the practice of re-exporting Russian gas to third countries was put into place. That ban accounted for 20% of the liquid natural gas that Russia exported into the EU, showing that Europe has been slowly closing the door on Russia's gas in 2025. These moves force Russia to rely even more heavily on the Central Asia Center pipeline. Ukraine knows this, and it's carefully chosen its moment to shut that pipeline down and cause serious problems for Russia. Hold on a second. Europe? For Europe to ban exports of Russian gas to third countries, it would have to be importing that gas in the first place. But isn't Europe part of the collective West that has sanctions? It is. And that leads back to the point made at the beginning of this video. Ukraine's August 2nd pipeline strike hasn't just affected Putin's industrial war machine or his attempts to gain influence in Central Asia and China. It's also a strike that's already proven just as effective, if not more so, as the sanctions that the West placed on Russia when it invaded Ukraine. Those sanctions were supposed to cut off Putin's gas lifelines long before Ukraine took the situation into its own hands. Those sanctions include the US and the UK banning the import of Russian oil and natural gas, as reported by the BBC in February 2024. Notice that the EU isn't party to those sanctions. It banned seaborne oil as part of its sanctions. But for several years of the Ukraine war, the EU failed to sanction Russian gas to anywhere near the sort of level that it might have had an impact on Russia. An EU phase ban is now in place on Russia's liquid natural gas, by the way, as is a ban on future EU country investments into Russia LNG. But it took the EU up until 2025 to start moving in that direction, which is the major problem. Russia has been making billions from the EU, completely counteracting the effects of sanctions in the process. The situation was so bad that the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air reported in April 2025 that EU imports of Russian gas in 2024 exceeded the amount of financial aid the organisation had sent to Ukraine during the same year. The numbers don't lie. The EU sent $21.73 billion of financial aid to Ukraine in 2024. During the same year, it spent $25.45 billion on Russian gas. That may have represented a 6% drop year-on-year in gas revenue for Russia from the EU, but it still means that money was pouring into Russia's coffers. What use are sanctions in that sort of situation? Worse yet, the decline in how much the EU was spending on Russian gas wasn't a result of the EU buying less gas, it was buying more. Ember Energy says that EU imports of Russian gas actually increased by 18% in 2024. So the EU was getting more Russian gas for less money than it had in 2023. A cynical mind might believe that the EU was taking advantage of sanctions that have affected Russia's ability to charge top dollar for its gas. However, the reality is, and has always been, that the EU is so tied up in Russian gas that a multi-year process is needed for the bloc's members to extract themselves. That process is in progress. As mentioned earlier, the EU has a phase-out plan in place that will lead to no more Russian gas contracts being signed by 2028. But again, that's a couple of years away. Ukraine achieved in one day what Western sanctions have failed to achieve in over 3.5 years of the Ukraine war, and still won't achieve until 2028. The reality is that the West's sanctions failed. Not outright, sanctions have impacted Russia's economy. The problem is that the West has failed to overcome its too little too late approach. That's the opinion of Bloomberg journalist Stephanie Baker, who published a book in 2024 entitled Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. According to the Centre for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, Baker highlights how Russian oligarchs have time and time again found ways to skirt sanctions placed against them ever since Russia started its short-lived war with Georgia in 2008. Poor enforcement and sanctions only coming into place once the horse has bolted from the stable have been issues for nearly 2 decades, CEPA notes. The EU's situation with Russia's gas is a perfect example. For sanctions on gas to really hurt Russia, the EU should have joined the US and UK in an outright ban. Instead, it took several years to institute a ban, and that is still a ban that will only come into force in a couple of years. So, can Ukraine be blamed for taking the gas situation into its own hands? Sanctions have failed the country, at least when it comes to gas. Still, the future is looking brighter for Ukraine on the gas front. The EU has finally gotten its act together, even if it was too late, which will eventually mean that many of Russia's European gas pipelines will become worthless. Russia still has others. The Power of Siberia pipeline connects Russia directly to China, for instance. But it's the Central Asia Center pipeline that represented Putin's backup plan for Russia's eventual loss of the EU as a gas customer. Ukraine has just shut that pipeline down, and there's no timeline for when it will come back online. Even when Russia gets it working again, Ukraine has proven it can hit the pipeline. More strikes will come against these soft targets. Ukraine might even organize strikes against the Power of Siberia pipeline. The pressure that sanctions were supposed to place on Russian gas will finally be exerted. It's just a shame that Ukraine had to take the situation into its own hands to make it happen. Now, Ukraine's focus on Russian energy doesn't end with the Central Asia Center pipeline. Oil refineries are another major target, and Ukraine just scored a direct hit in Saratov. A mushroom cloud has erupted inside Russia as yet another oil refinery burns to the ground. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering the devastating impact Ukrainian strikes are having against Russia's energy infrastructure.